I was on my Peloton doing a high interval, some shit, gasping, I'm dying, and the instructor said...
This song is from the soundtrack of a movie called Tenet. Did anybody see this besides me?
Started talking about one of my films.
What the was going on in that movie?
Because that's a couple hours of my life I'll never get back again.
And that's 2.5 hours of my life that I want back. Seriously, you need to be a neuroscientist to understand.
When Rex Reed takes a shit on your film, he doesn't ask you to work out more.
By pretty much any metric, Tenet is Christopher Nolan's least successful movie. Across his filmography, it's the lowest ranked on Rotten Tomatoes by both the critical consensus and the audience score. It's also the lowest ranked of his movies on Letterboxd. It's his only movie that has made less than double its budget back at the box office, and besides The Dark Knight Rises, it has the lowest number of Oscar nominations of any of his movies since The Prestige. And if you ask most casual moviegoers, then if they have seen it at all, then their main takeaway from that experience was probably that the music was too loud and that they didn't understand the plot.
What the was going on in that movie?
But like a lot of movies that were misunderstood and underappreciated when they first came out, Tenet has been undergoing something of a renaissance. Slowly but surely, people are starting to appreciate that Tenet is a movie unlike any other. Why? Well, take your pick. There's the insane action sequences, all of which we get to experience twice because of the movie's palindrome-like structure. There's that insane score that will be resonating in your brain for weeks after you see the movie. There's 𝗩𝗘𝗏𝗘𝗢𝗏's stunning cinematography that fully captures the beautiful locations of this globe-trotting adventure on 70mm IMAX film. There's Kenneth Branagh's scene-chewing villain 𝗬𝗘𝗡𝗧𝗏, John David Washington's underappreciated protagonist, Elizabeth Debicki's steely determination, and Robert Pattinson showing off 60s era Bond levels of charm and charisma. And of course there's Christopher Nolan's precise direction orchestrating it all into a cinematic experience that only gets better and better every time you watch it. And some people look at all of that and go, yeah, but the music was too loud and the main character was kind of boring. Jesus Christ. So in this video, I want to look at why Tenet is having a renaissance and why more and more people are learning not to understand it, but to feel it. And to help me do that, I've roped in some help from one of the biggest Tenet heads on the internet, friend of the channel Griffin Schiller from FilmSpeak. And if you don't know what a Tenet head is, this is a Tenet head.
Getting to see that in a theater again on film with a packed house of people who like were enthusiastic for that movie was incredible. And so I'm watching this thing and like everyone's stoked, everyone's amped up at the prologue with the protagonist running around and trying to figure out all that stuff. But then like every time Priya mentions Oppenheimer, people were cheering. When Ives says like temporal pincer movement, everyone was like, whoa! And it was like, there were just like these, it felt like I was watching a screening of The Room.
But first, let's hear from the man himself, Christopher Nolan.
Do you understand everything in Tenet? You're not meant to understand everything in Tenet. It's not all comprehensible. I think that where people encounter frustrations with my narratives in the past, sometimes I think they're slightly missing the point. It's not a puzzle to be unpacked. It's an experience to be had.
Tenet is not a puzzle, but an experience, and that is so important to the movie that the movie itself actually tells us this.
Don't try to understand it. Feel it.
But that feels like a bit of a cop-out, right? Like, we can just hand-wave away plot holes or poor characterization because, oh, we're not meant to understand it. Well, yes and no.
What's the answer? There's no answer. It's a paradox.
A fundamental part of film criticism and media literacy in general is, when you consume a piece of media, look at the choices the artists made and ask why they made that choice. A lot of the things people criticize Tenet for, like the incomprehensible dialogue, the flat character,
That's all they've told you?
the complex plot,
Like Feynman and Wheeler's notion of a positron is an electron, moving backwards in time.
these are all intentional choices. Now, of course, that doesn't excuse them from criticism, but criticizing them on face value like that is a bit pointless when you're dealing with a filmmaker of Nolan's pedigree, because what you should be asking is why that decision was made.
In that regard, that's why it's like the perfect movie for me, because I go into every movie with that kind of approach. I want to meet the filmmaker where they're at, understand what they're trying to accomplish. With any artist, whether you're looking at a painting in a museum or something like that, you always want to go in there and kind of like try and wrap your head around, what are you getting at? What am I getting out of this from like what you're putting in.
Like, take the protagonist. He is often criticized for being a bland character with no backstory or motivations. For the record, I totally disagree on the first part. John David Washington brings a level of physicality to his performance matched only by the likes of Tom Cruise, and when the scene calls for it, he absolutely draws you into what he is feeling or thinking. Also, he's full of smarmy one-liners that he delivers with the perfect level of irony.
I ordered my hot sauce an hour ago.
And I guarantee you Nolan didn't script that. That feels like a John David Washingtonism that he just kind of like threw in there because it felt true to the character, kind of like when Sean Connery would throw in like one-liners, or Roger Moore would throw in one-liners with his stuff. That felt like his kind of like spin on that.
But as for that broader point of his lack of characterization, well, that's kind of the entire point of the character.
I think there's something, for me, there's something really compelling about jumping into a story and being told essentially to concentrate on the here and now. Ironically, it's a film that deals with time, but it's really important as you watch the film that you're just kind of looking over this guy's shoulder and going with him. Yeah. It's a very present tense presence in the film. And so deliberately not naming him, not including any of that information about how he might have arrived there, I think hopefully it draws attention to that idea and keeps people really focused on the here and now.
Nolan wanted us to come into the story in the present. The protagonist's background or the specifics of who he is are not important to this story. What's important is how he acts and how he solves the problems that are in front of him.
I started off in the noir genre, as we talked about earlier, and that's a genre in which you define character through action. People can talk about who they are and what motivates them, but you don't trust them. You wait and see, what do they actually do? What do they do to each other? And that's essential to the way that genre works. I think that's the most strong form of characterization.
To do the inevitable James Bond comparison, until Daniel Craig came along, the Bond movies did not touch on his backstory at all. Sean Connery just appeared in the role as a fully formed, suited and booted 007, and we just followed him on his adventures. Nolan has been very open about the extent to which the Bond movies have inspired him, but he's also spoken about how the mysterious protagonist has always been a staple of the spy and noir genres.
I really wanted to tap into that kind of great tradition of the anonymous protagonist. I mean, for me, it dates back to the TV show The Prisoner, for example, where he's known by a number, or the number he resists, number 6, known as The Prisoner.
So he made an intentional choice to have these aspects of the protagonist's character be left to the imagination, and I think the movie is stronger for it. Criticizing the protagonist for not having a fleshed out backstory or motivation is like saying Clint Eastwood's character in The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly doesn't have a fleshed out backstory or motivation. Like, yeah, that's correct, but it's also the entire point of the character, who is literally called the man with no name. In both cases, the mystery of the character is not an accident. It was a very deliberate choice.
I was thinking a lot of Sergio Leone westerns, like with Clint Eastwood as, the man with no name.
Yeah. But look, I didn't want to make one of those Tenet is good actually video essays because there are already several out there that do a better job than I could, so I've linked to my favorite ones in the description if that's the sort of thing that you want. No, my aim with this video was to look at the circumstances of Tenet's original release and to explore why it is having a renaissance as more and more people slowly rediscover it. So let's invert time and ride in an airtight shipping container all the way back to 2020, because I think the context of Tenet's release is a major reason why it has the reputation it does.
What's happened's happened.
As you might remember, there was a global pandemic in 2020 and governments around the world imposed various levels of lockdown to stop it killing everyone, and the film industry wasn't isolated from that.
Most people were just staying at home, inside, days blending together, movies weren't getting released. Instead, they were going straight to like VOD, and they were all like reject weird C-list movies. Like, like nothing good or substantial was really coming out because entire theatrical slates were like shifted back a year. But
Tenet only got pushed out by a month, from July to August, and I think that ultimately was what had the biggest impact on Tenet's initial reception. Everyone knows that Nolan is a passionate advocate for the cinematic experience, and he fought tooth and nail with Warner Brothers to give Tenet the full theatrical release it deserved. Warner Brothers, on the other hand, were hesitant about whether or not audiences would show up at all, given the state of the pandemic at the time.
People weren't really concerned, like a priority was not going to the movies for them. It was like other stuff. It was like making sure that they didn't get sick, that other families didn't get sick.
I mean, Nolan must have known that releasing Tenet into a world very much still trying to understand the pandemic would lead to a poor box office result. But from Nolan's point of view, he wanted Tenet to be what Top Gun Maverick ended up being, the movie that got everyone going back to the cinema.
I know people were kind of like, they kind of soured on him a little bit for what he was trying to do, thinking like he was arrogant and irresponsible and all of this stuff. But I think the reality was that he saw an industry that he loves dearly, which is the theatrical marketplace, movie theaters, suffering. And he wanted to do whatever was in his power to try and help them out. What you can distribute is a film. You can give people a reason to go back to the movies, which is what he happened to have a movie coming out that year. And so for better or worse, that was kind of what he put Tenet on. And so I remember a lot of people kind of like challenging him on that and being like, oh, this is like, you know, we have a pandemic going on and stuff like what are you thinking about? Or like, why are you doing this? The reality was that theaters were operating. They had protocols in place prior to the release of Tenet. But they weren't doing well. People didn't necessarily want to go back to the theater to see Raiders of the Lost Ark when they could just watch it at home in the middle of a pandemic. So they needed a reason to go back to the theater, which is where Nolan kind of comes in with that.
But Nolan played his hand too early. I totally agree with him that Tenet should not have been a streaming first release, but I do think that Warner Brothers were right to try and delay the release until people were ready to go back to the theaters. After all, this is what happened with other successful post-pandemic blockbusters like No Time to Die and, well, Top Gun Maverick. Also, I have absolutely no proof of this whatsoever, but my crazy conspiracy theory is that Nolan is such an obsessive that he wanted Tenet to come out in 2020 so that it would keep the symmetry of the date to match the title palindrome when people wrote about it. Ridiculous? Absolutely. True? Definitely not. The sort of detail a perfectionist like Nolan would care about? 100%. Anyway, regardless of the reasons or intentions, Tenet's release was a misfire by Nolan standards. While it is a testament to his pulling power that it still made over $300 million in the midst of a pandemic, it was still the first Nolan movie to not turn what the studio would consider to be a healthy profit on its $200 million budget. In its domestic run in the US, it only made $58 million, and for context, that's less than Morbius.
It's a kind of movie that relies on repeat viewings. And so during a pandemic, you're not necessarily going to go back and keep seeing this movie. I know Nolan probably, foolishly so thought, oh, this is great. It's a movie that relies on repeat viewings. We're going to get people coming back for more and coming back for more after they've already kind of experienced this. And then on top of just like him wanting to help something that was personal to him. But I just think people were at a different place, and it was like, if they didn't really get it the first time around, like, are you going to risk going back to a theater again?
I was lucky enough to see Tenet for the first time in a mostly empty theater, but the box office numbers prove that most people didn't. That means they ended up watching it for the first time on some form of home media months or even years later, which is exactly what Nolan had tried to avoid. And by the time they got around to seeing it, a consensus had already formed based on its lukewarm critical reception and the wider conversation around the movie focusing quite a lot on things like its sound mixing or the complexities of the plot.
The critical reception to that film definitely feels linked to everything else that was kind of going on in the world at that time. Like, people were like I remember reading reviews that were like pretty critical of him releasing the film, and I'm like wondering, how much did that affect your overall enjoyment of the movie, your overall takeaway?
So a lot of people went into the movie with all of this context shaping their opinion, consciously or not.
What the was going on in that movie? Do you understand?
And to be totally honest, I kind of felt a similar way when I first watched Tenet, and I did see it in a theater. I had thoroughly enjoyed it, but I was also confused by the story and annoyed at the sound mixing and the inaudibility of lots of the dialogue. I was kind of disappointed that Nolan had delivered such an impressive high-concept movie, but that it seemed to have dropped the ball on some of the fundamentals. But then something happened. I couldn't get the score out of my head, and as I went about my days, I just kept hearing it. So I pulled it up on Spotify and played it, and as it played, I could see the images of the movie in my mind. The opera siege, the Freeport, the car chase, the final battle, this shot. This movie had inceptioned its way into my brain and I could not stop thinking about it. And I wasn't thinking about the muffled dialogue. I was thinking about how it felt to watch this. So I went to see it again, and then it clicked. Tenet is fucking awesome.
Well, I've seen too much.
Tenet is awesome specifically because it is not a movie that is trying to be understood. It is trying to deliver an experience. And once you put aside your preconceptions about how a movie like this should tell its story and build its world, you can just fully immerse yourself into that experience and just let yourself be swept up in it. To explore this a bit more, let's listen to how Nolan talks about his first time watching another movie that is just as complex and ambiguous as Tenet is.
I did have the very special experience of going to see 2001 on a film print. I remember just feeling the enormity of the image and the potential for that screen to kind of, just take you anywhere. And I saw it when I was 7 years old, and I think I understood it certainly as well then as I do now, maybe better. I think maybe better because you take it for granted, you experience it, and the beauty and the magnitude of the images and the feeling of, traveling across the solar system or whatever. I mean, that's the point of the film. It's a sort of wood for the trees thing. I think as a kid, you're actually pretty open to those visceral experiences. And I think a lot of your appreciation of movies and the entertainment value of movies is very simple.
Now, putting aside the fact that a 7-year-old Christopher Nolan watched 2001 and enjoyed it, I love that comparison about watching movies when you were a kid and how you didn't really care too much about the story or plot holes or whatever it is the internet tells you to care about. It was just about the experience and the magic, and instead of getting hung up on the details, you can just see the whole thing and take it in. It's kind of like how you can't always hear or understand all the lyrics in your favorite song, but that doesn't stop it from meaning something to you.
The important thing isn't can you read music, it's can you hear it.
Let's come back to that interview with 𝗙𝗓𝗏𝗡𝗅.
You're not meant to understand everything in Tenet. It's not all comprehensible. It's this sort of, it's a bit like asking if I know what happens to the spinning top at the end of Inception, or the particular.
Do you know what happens to the spinning
ambiguities.
top at the end of Inception?
I have to have my idea of it for it to be a valid, productive ambiguity. But the point of it is it's an ambiguity.
Something I love about Inception is how perfectly crafted it is, and how the story, while complex, is fully explained within the movie except for that final ambiguity. You don't get it all when you first watch it, but if you see it a few times, then you realize that you are given all the clues you need to understand it. The same goes for Memento, Interstellar, and The Prestige.
Are you watching closely?
Tenet does not give you all the clues, and that is intentional. And it's intentional in the way that the ending of Inception is intentionally ambiguous about whether or not Cobb is still dreaming. There are hints, of course, but it's not explicit, and that is the point, because otherwise the ending wouldn't have the same impact. And as Nolan says, focusing on those details is not really the point of the ending.
As Emma always likes to say, the point is that the character doesn't care whether it falls or not.
Tenet is a feature-length version of the Inception cliffhanger. The point of it is that it's an ambiguity. There is no right or wrong answer, and the film tells us this.
What's the answer?
There's no answer. It's a paradox.
But that takes time for people to appreciate, and for most of us it requires seeing the movie more than once to understand it. And that is why we are now witnessing... I talked earlier about some of the video essays explaining Tenet, and I do think that videos like these have really helped audiences connect with the movie over time. They invited people to give it another shot, and to reconsider their possibly negative first impressions by giving them a new perspective with which to watch and appreciate what the movie is trying to do. Another reason for the 𝗘𝗏𝗧𝗏 was its IMAX re-release ahead of Dune Part 2. For a lot of audiences, this will have been the first time they've had the chance to experience it as it was meant to be seen. I was lucky enough to see it on the biggest screen in the UK a few weeks ago, and what can I say, it absolutely rocked, and it was also pretty much completely sold out. And even though the IMAX re-release is the sort of thing that appeals to film geeks like me, it just highlights how consistently popular Christopher Nolan is as a filmmaker, and the fact that Tenet's original performance in 2020 had so much more to do with the wider circumstances of its release than it did with the quality of the film itself.
I genuinely believe, had the pandemic not happened, that Tenet would also be up there with like really high performers. I still think it would be like divisive, but I just by nature of like how complicated it is or whatever, but I think people would be willing to give it a bit more.
But I think the reason you've probably been hearing a lot more about Tenet in recent months is because of Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer is the most commercially successful Christopher Nolan movie since The Dark Knight Rises, which is over a decade old. His movies since then consistently turned a profit and made a big splash, but Dunkirk came out 3 years before Tenet, and as we have seen, Tenet underperformed by Nolan standards, and then it took another 3 years for Oppie to come along. So until Oppenheimer, general audiences who don't spend their free time watching video essays on YouTube or playing the docking sequence from Interstellar on repeat probably hadn't seen one of Nolan's movies in a cinema for about 6 years.
Like, it reminded them like, oh yeah, this is why we like going to the movies. Like, not just for like Avengers 15 or whatever. Like, it's something with substance. It's something with craft, with stuff on its mind.
I think Oppenheimer reminded people what it was they liked about Nolan's movies, and that made people decide to give that Tenet movie another shot. But this time it was different. Like a temporal pincer movement, they were coming back to the same thing but with a totally different perspective because they had a renewed appreciation for Nolan's style.
But then also, like, on a more thematic level, I think Oppenheimer, watching that film and seeing all the things that like he's kind of musing on in that movie is in conversation with Tenet.
In a weird way, with Tenet, Nolan kind of made a sequel to Oppenheimer before he made Oppenheimer, which is a very Tenet thing to happen. After Oppenheimer, audiences had a better understanding of Nolan's subjective approach of following a story from the perspective of a particular character. They were reminded how he uses sound and music to enhance the story and to convey what the character was thinking or feeling. They saw how he played with the linear flow of time in a way that enhanced the narrative and revisited previous scenes in a way that gave us new perspectives on them. And they saw how he managed to capture everything in camera. Oppenheimer reminded people that Nolan's movies feel real and that there is a huge amount of work going on behind the camera in order to deliver the best possible cinematic experience.
I was fortunate enough to go to that the 70mm IMAX screening where he and Villeneuve had that conversation. But the thing that I kind of latched onto that I haven't heard him talk about, but makes so much sense why like I'm kind of addicted to this film in a weird way, is it's only a movie that could exist on film. It specifically uses the language of cinema in order to evoke an emotional response, and it's not necessarily something you can articulate. It was this really fascinating exercise for him on emotional intelligence and like how do you play with that while like kind of ignoring the logical side of it, while like not trying to I guess like talk about it.
If you liked Oppenheimer, then chances are you'll enjoy rewatching Tenet with that new perspective on Nolan's style. And the clues that the movie as a whole will be better the second time you watch it are baked into the film itself. Tenet revisits previous scenes within its own narrative, and when it does so, it is giving us a new perspective on them. Like when you watch the protagonist fight himself for the first time, it's confusing and disorientating. But when we come back to it, we suddenly have a whole new perspective on the same scene, and so we experience it completely differently. Because something you'll notice about this fight when you rewatch the movie is that when you see it for the second time, it's not just the same fight with the film reversed. It's shot differently, and the edit places a different emphasis on the masked protagonist because that is the person who we're experiencing the fight with this time. You'll even notice that the lens of his mask is clear in the second fight, whereas it's totally black when you see it for the first time. Because we are always seeing things from the protagonist's point of view in his own timeline. So when he first has that fight, he is fighting for his life against a mysterious antagonist. But the second time, he's just doing everything he can not to harm his former self, and just to escape to the turnstile. And that is conveyed in the filmmaking language by shooting and editing it in a different way. Even if you didn't consciously notice it, it is something you feel.
And you see him get into the room with the turnstile, and you're sort of like, oh shit, is he the guy who comes out on the other side? And then it's like, when it actually happens, the way the score kind of kicks in, the way that John David Washington just like full-blown sprints out of there. I mean, it was funny just like watching it with some people who, you know, have never seen it, and they're just like, holy shit. And it's just like, there's so many moments in the movie that that just elicit that response out of people.
And just like how watching this fight or the plane crash or the car chase the second time in the movie gives you a different perspective, so too does watching the entire movie a second time. Once you have seen the complete whole, going back and watching it again will feel like watching a different movie, and that feeling never goes away. The magic of Tenet is that you always find something else to love and appreciate, and yet the thrill it gives you never goes away. It is so rare for a movie to be able to achieve that. A lot of people had a bad first impression of this movie because of the circumstances of its release, and that can be hard to shake off. But Tenet has always been telling you to go back.
You have a future in the past.
So try and watch it again with an open mind and ideally a good sound system. But this time, don't try to understand it. Feel it. A huge thanks again to Griffin from FilmSpeak for agreeing to talk about Tenet with me for so long. Go watch his videos if you haven't already, and if you want to see our full chat, I've uploaded the whole thing for patrons at the second breakfast tier and higher. We basically talk about Tenet, Nolan, and James Bond for the better part of an hour, so go check that out if that's the sort of thing that you're interested in. Plus, if you do watch it, you will even be able to get to see what I look like when I'm not pretending to be a cartoon penguin. Talk about exclusive behind the scenes stuff. And if you join the Patreon, then you also get access to the back catalogue of bonus videos and a bunch of other cool stuff, and you help keep videos like this one sponsor free. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you think of Tenet in the comments below, and I'll see you next time.